the forgotten rituals of blood justice. In the shadows of human history lie practices so ancient and primal that modern minds struggle to comprehend them. These were not merely punishments or executions, but elaborate ceremonies where justice itself was believed to flow through blood, where the act of taking life became a sacred ritual connecting the earthly realm to divine judgment. Today, we delve into the forgotten world of blood justice, where death was not the end of punishment, but the beginning of a spiritual transformation that would echo through both worlds of the living and the dead. Our journey begins in the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Germania, where Celtic druids practiced rituals of justice that modern archaeology is only beginning to understand. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that could last for days and involved entire communities in their execution. The Celts believed that certain crimes created spiritual imbalances that could only be corrected through blood sacrifice. But this was not simple execution. It was a complex ritual designed to restore cosmic harmony through the controlled release of life force. Picture this. A criminal convicted of betraying their clan is brought to a sacred grove at the dark of the moon. The trees themselves have been chosen for their spiritual significance, ancient oaks whose roots are believed to connect directly to the underworld. The accused is not simply killed, but becomes the central figure in a ceremony that will unfold over 3 days and nights. The ritual begins with purification. The condemned is bathed in spring water mixed with herbs and their own blood, drawn from small cuts made with ceremonial flint blades. This mixture is believed to prepare their spirit for the journey between worlds. Celtic priests chant in languages so old that even they no longer understand all the words, following traditions passed down through generations of oral teaching. On the second day, the blood-letting begins in earnest. Using bronze knives consecrated in sacred fires, the druids make precise cuts designed to release the victim's life force slowly. But this is not torture for its own sake. Each cut has symbolic meaning, representing the specific crimes committed and the spiritual debts that must be paid. The blood that flows is not wasted. It is collected in carved wooden bowls and mixed with sacred waters, creating a substance the Celts believed could carry messages to the gods. This mixture is used to anoint standing stones, water springs, and the foreheads of witnesses, binding the entire community to the act of justice being performed. By the third night, as the victim's life ebbs away, the ritual reaches its climax. The dying person is expected to speak prophecies, as the approaching boundary between life and death is believed to grant supernatural insight. These final words are carefully recorded by the druids and become part of the tribe's sacred knowledge. The body is not buried or burned in the normal way. Instead, it is placed in a specially prepared bog, where the acidic water will preserve it for eternity. The Celts believed this prevented the criminal's spirit from finding rest, ensuring their punishment continued in the afterlife. Modern archaeology has uncovered dozens of these bog bodies across northern Europe, their preservation so perfect that we can still see the ritual cuts, the braided hair, and even the expressions on their faces from over 2,000 years ago. Moving eastward, we encounter the blood justice rituals of ancient Mesopotamia, where the world's first written laws were supplemented by ceremonies that predated written history by millennia. In the city-states of Sumer and Babylon, certain crimes were believed to contaminate not just the criminal, but their entire bloodline. These offenses, particularly those involving sacred temples or royal families, required purification rituals that would cleanse the spiritual pollution through systematic blood sacrifice. The ritual known as the sevenfold cleansing was reserved for the most serious spiritual crimes. The condemned and 6 members of their family would be brought to the temple of Marduk, where a ceremony lasting 7 days would purify their bloodline through controlled death. Each day, one family member would be sacrificed using methods specific to their relationship to the original criminal. Spouses were drowned in sacred pools, symbolizing the washing away of conjugal contamination. Children were burned alive on altar fires, representing the purification of inherited guilt. Parents were buried alive beneath temple foundations, making them eternal guardians against spiritual pollution. The original criminal was saved for last, and their death was the most elaborate. Babylonian texts describe a process where the victim's blood was slowly drained and mixed with clay to create bricks for temple construction. The idea was that their life force would become permanently bound to the sacred building, serving the gods for eternity as penance for their crimes. But perhaps no civilization elevated blood justice to greater artistic heights than ancient Egypt. Here, the rituals were not just about punishment or purification, but about maintaining the cosmic order that kept the universe itself functioning. Egyptian blood justice centered around the concept of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth and justice that held creation together. When someone committed crimes that violated Ma'at, the resulting spiritual imbalance threatened to unravel reality itself. Only through precise ritual bloodshed could the balance be restored. The most elaborate of these ceremonies was the judgment of the 42 gods, performed when someone was convicted of crimes against divine order. The ritual took place in specially constructed chambers beneath the great temples, spaces designed to replicate the afterlife courtroom where souls were judged after death. The condemned would be brought before 42 priests, each representing one of the divine judges. Over the course of 42 hours, one for each judge, the victim would be subjected to specific torments designed to extract confessions for every possible sin. The bloodletting was carefully controlled and symbolic. Each drop that fell was collected in vessels inscribed with hieroglyphs describing the specific crime being atoned for. This blood would later be used in the temple's daily rituals, literally feeding the gods the life force needed to maintain cosmic order. But the most haunting aspect of Egyptian blood justice was the preservation of the victim's consciousness throughout the process. Using techniques that modern medical science still doesn't fully understand, Egyptian priest-physicians could keep victims awake and aware even as their life force was systematically drained. The goal was not cruelty, but spiritual necessity. The Egyptians believed that unconscious death was spiritually worthless. Only a fully aware sacrifice could provide the conscious life energy needed to power their religious ceremonies. Papyrus scrolls discovered in tomb complexes describe victims being kept conscious for days through careful administration of stimulants and pain management techniques. The blood extracted during these extended ceremonies was considered the most potent spiritual substance available to Egyptian priests. In the Americas, the Aztec Empire developed blood justice rituals that combined religious ceremony with public spectacle in ways that both terrified and unified their vast territories. The Aztec concept of justice was inseparable from their understanding of cosmic balance. They believed the universe was constantly threatened by chaos and could only be maintained through regular offerings of human blood and hearts to the gods. Criminal justice became a way of obtaining this necessary spiritual fuel while simultaneously maintaining social order. The most elaborate Aztec blood justice ritual was Shumulpili, performed every 52 years to prevent the end of the world. Criminals who had committed the most serious offenses were saved specifically for this ceremony, as their deaths were believed to carry extra spiritual weight due to their guilt. The ritual began with a procession through Tenochtitlan that could last for days. Hundreds of condemned criminals, painted with symbols representing their specific crimes, would be marched through every district of the city. Citizens were required to spit on them, throw refuse, and ritually curse them, adding layers of spiritual contamination that would make their eventual sacrifice more powerful. At the Great Temple, the blood-letting began with preliminary ceremonies designed to maximize the spiritual energy that would be released. Victims were forced to drink potions made from hallucinogenic plants, not to dull their pain, but to open their consciousness to the spirit world and make their life force more accessible to the gods. The actual executions were performed by priests who had trained for decades in the precise techniques required. Using obsidian knives sharper than modern surgical instruments, they could remove a beating heart in seconds while keeping the victim conscious long enough to see their own heart offered to the gods. But the Aztecs didn't stop with simple heart extraction. The blood that poured from each victim was collected in elaborate systems of channels and pools carved into the temple stone. This blood would flow down the temple steps, symbolically feeding the earth and ensuring agricultural fertility for the coming year. The bodies of blood justice victims received special treatment that emphasized their role as spiritual intermediaries. Their skin was carefully removed and worn by priests during subsequent ceremonies, allowing the living to literally embody the spiritual transformation the criminals had undergone through death. Moving to Asia, we find that ancient China developed blood justice rituals that combined Confucian concepts of social harmony with older shamanic traditions about the power of controlled death. Chinese blood justice centered around the idea that crimes created tears in the social fabric that could only be repaired through corresponding tears in the criminal's body. But these were not random wounds. They were precise, symbolic cuts that had to match the nature and severity of the original offense. The ritual known as Thousand Cuts Justice was reserved for the most serious crimes against social order. Unlike the similar punishment of lynching, this was not simply execution by torture, but a carefully orchestrated ceremony designed to restore cosmic balance through systematic blood release. The criminal would be brought to a specially prepared courtyard where hundreds of community members could witness the restoration of justice. Each cut was made by a different person, family members of victims, community leaders, even random citizens chosen by lottery. This distributed participation meant that the entire community became invested in the act of justice being performed. The blood from each cut was collected and mixed with ink, which was then used to write the names of the criminal's victims on paper that would be burned during the ceremony. This practice was believed to carry the names of the wronged to the afterlife, where they could receive compensation from the criminal's tormented spirit. But perhaps the most sophisticated blood justice rituals were developed in medieval Europe, where Christian theology combined with older pagan traditions to create ceremonies that were both deeply religious and terrifyingly brutal. The ritual known as trial by ordeal of sacred blood was used when conventional evidence was insufficient to determine guilt or innocence. The accused would be subjected to controlled bleeding while prayers were recited, and the behavior of their blood was interpreted as divine judgment. If blood flowed freely and appeared bright red, this was taken as a sign of innocence. If it clotted quickly or appeared dark, guilt was confirmed. But the ritual didn't end with this determination. It continued until the accused either died from blood loss or experienced what was interpreted as divine intervention. These ceremonies took place in specially consecrated spaces, often the crypts beneath churches, where the proximity to holy relics was believed to enhance divine communication. The blood that was released during these rituals was considered sacred and was used to anoint religious objects or mixed into the mortar of church construction. Medieval accounts describe blood justice ceremonies that lasted for days, with the accused kept barely alive through careful medical attention while their blood was slowly extracted and interpreted for divine signs. Monks specially trained in medical techniques would monitor the victim's condition, ensuring they remained conscious and able to confess any final sins before death. The most extreme form of medieval blood justice was reserved for those convicted of witchcraft or heresy. These crimes were believed to contaminate not just the criminal, but potentially the entire community. The purification required was correspondingly extreme. Victims of heresy trials would undergo purification by sacred bleeding, where their blood was extracted and examined for signs of demonic contamination. Blood that appeared abnormally colored or behaved strangely when mixed with holy water was taken as proof of supernatural corruption. The extracted blood would be subjected to various tests mixed with consecrated wine, dropped onto blessed salt, or heated over sacred flames. Each reaction was interpreted according to complex theological principles that determined not just the extent of the victim's guilt, but the specific spiritual remedies required. In some cases, the blood itself became the focus of additional ceremonies. If it was deemed particularly contaminated, it would be subjected to elaborate exorcism rituals before being buried in consecrated ground. If it showed signs of purification during the extraction process, it might be preserved as a relic demonstrating divine justice. What united all these diverse traditions of blood justice was the belief that blood itself was more than just a physical substance. It was the carrier of spiritual essence, the bridge between earthly crime and divine judgment. These rituals served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment. They provided communities with dramatic demonstrations of justice being served. They reinforced religious and social hierarchies, and they created shared experiences that bonded witnesses together through participation in something both terrible and sacred. The psychological impact on both victims and witnesses was profound and intentional. These were not quick executions designed to end suffering, but extended ceremonies designed to transform suffering into spiritual meaning. Modern psychology recognizes that these blood justice rituals served important social functions despite their brutality. They provided outlets for community anger, reinforced shared values, and created clear boundaries around acceptable behavior. But they also reveal the human capacity for transforming violence into sacred meaning, for finding spiritual significance in the systematic destruction of human life. The elaborate justifications, the careful procedures, the religious symbolism, all of these elements allowed communities to participate in extreme cruelty while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness. The weapons and tools used in blood justice were often works of art in themselves, crafted by master smiths and consecrated through elaborate religious ceremonies. Aztec obsidian knives, Celtic bronze blades, Egyptian ceremonial daggers, these were not mere instruments of death, but sacred objects believed to channel divine power. The training required to perform these rituals was extensive and often took years to complete. Practitioners needed to master not just the physical techniques of controlled bleeding and life preservation, but also the complex religious and legal knowledge that justified and guided each ceremony. As we examine these forgotten rituals of blood justice, we're confronted with uncomfortable questions about human nature and the relationship between violence and meaning. These practices were not the products of primitive savagery, but of sophisticated civilizations with complex legal systems, advanced medical knowledge, and elaborate religious philosophies. The people who developed and performed these rituals were often the most educated and respected members of their societies: priests, judges, physicians, and scholars who genuinely believed they were serving justice and maintaining cosmic order. This reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within all human cultures and can be justified by the highest ideals and most sophisticated reasoning. The difference between civilization and barbarism may be less clear than we would like to believe. The decline of blood justice rituals came not from moral enlightenment alone, but from changing concepts of evidence, individual rights, and the relationship between earthly and divine authority. As legal systems became more sophisticated and religious authority became more centralized, the need for elaborate ritual demonstrations of justice diminished. But traces of these ancient practices persist in modern legal and religious ceremonies. The symbolism of courtroom rituals, the language of religious sacrifice, even the way we talk about justice being served or criminals paying their debt, all of these echo the ancient belief that wrongdoing creates spiritual imbalances that must be corrected through suffering. As we reflect on these forgotten rituals of blood justice, we're reminded both of how far human civilization has progressed in developing humane legal systems, and of how recently these changes have occurred. For most of human history, justice was indeed written in blood, and the boundary between punishment and religious ceremony was often invisible. The echoes of ancient ritual chambers have long since faded, but the questions they raise about justice, suffering, and the search for meaning in violence remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.